Everybody in that room agreed it was the coldest thing Walter Grimes ever did to his own blood. Nora stood in that attorney's office while her brother and sister split smiles over her inheritance. A rusted key to a condemned farmhouse appraised at $9. A place the county wanted demolished. But as Raymond and Sylvia walked away clutching their checks, they couldn't see what they'd actually done. They'd handed Nora the one thing money can't buy: a starting point. They laughed at rubble, never once picturing those worn, aching hands of hers lifting stone after stone. There would be no hidden fortune, no lucky break. Nora would drag her own worth up from the dirt, brick by brick, until she'd built something so real, so undeniable, that the very people who threw her away would return and beg to be let back in. Keep listening. Because the moment Raymond and Sylvia finally stepped through that farmhouse door and saw what Nora had created, their faces told a story their mouths couldn't form. Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from. And if this one gets under your skin, hit subscribe. The law office of Hawkins & Briggs occupied the second floor of a slim brick building along the main drag in Clarksville, Tennessee. The kind of place that smelled of yellowed paper and furniture polish. Framed certificates lined every wall. The receptionist spoke barely above a whisper, as if the building itself demanded reverence. On the morning of March 14th, Nora Callahan lowered herself into a chair too stiff and too proper for a woman in a thrift store sweater and boots held together with electrical tape. 36 years old. Dark auburn hair yanked back with a rubber band she'd fished from the bottom of her purse. To her left sat Chloe, 9, drawing quiet shapes on a notepad the receptionist had offered her. To her right, Ben, 6 years old, pressed against his mother's arm with that hollow stillness children carry when they've moved too much and slept too little. Nora's father, Walter Grimes, had died 5 weeks before, 71, a stroke before dawn, gone before paramedics reached the door. He'd been a quiet man, a complicated one, a former tobacco farmer who spent his final 2 decades drifting between small rural Tennessee properties, buying cheap, selling cheaper, forever reaching toward a life that never quite took shape. Nora had been the one driving 4 hours every few months to look in on him. She'd organized his medications after his first minor stroke 3 years prior, sat beside his hospital bed through 2 separate stays, helped him make sense of the paperwork doctors left behind. She hadn't done any of it for a reward. She'd done it because he was her father. And because no one else showed up. Her siblings, Raymond and Sylvia, had their own orbits. Raymond, 43, operated a decent landscaping business in Nashville. He had a gift for making his absence sound noble. Sylvia, 41, had married into comfort in Chattanooga. She communicated in clipped texts and birthday cards that arrived 3 days late. Neither one had visited Walter in the last 2 years of his life. Nora didn't need anyone to tell her that. Every time she pulled up to her father's small rental house, the guest room sat untouched. Same towel folded on the bed, same half-empty water bottle on the nightstand. Sylvia permitted herself a thin smile and scratched something into the leather notebook she'd brought along, already calculating. Neither of them glanced at Nora. Hawkins went quiet. He slipped off his glasses, drew the cloth from his breast pocket, wiped the lenses once, set them back on his face. Then he looked at Nora with something she'd carry for the rest of her life. Not pity, but close. Something that already knew what was about to land. To my daughter Nora, he read, I leave the property located at 22 Dust Mill Road, Harlan County, Tennessee. The farmhouse, all structures on the land, all contents therein, and the 3.4 acres on which it stands. Raymond laughed first, a short, clipped sound, like he was holding it back. Then he wasn't holding anything back at all. Sylvia pressed her hand to her mouth, but her shoulders gave her away. Nora didn't move. "What property is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad picked it up at a tax auction about 8 years back," Raymond said, dragging a knuckle under his eye. "Paid $9, 9, because no living soul wanted it. He used to talk about fixing it up one day, never touched it. The county's been on him for years, either renovate or tear it down." "It's condemned," Sylvia added, steadying herself. "There was a fire years ago. One side took partial damage. Sections of the roof have collapsed inward. I believe there's even a structural violation notice filed against it." She aimed something at Nora that wore the costume of sympathy. "It's a liability, that's what it is." Hawkins drew a manila envelope from his file and slid it across the table. Inside, documents and a key. Old iron, dark with age. Heavier than it looked. "There's one condition," Hawkins said. "The property cannot be sold for a period of 18 months from the date of Walter Grimes's passing. After that window closes, you're free to sell or dispose of it however you choose." 18 months, Raymond said under his breath. 18 months of property taxes on a condemned building you can't get rid of. Sylvia leaned in. The offer was already rehearsed. "Once the 18 months are up, we'll take it off your hands. We could probably do 10, maybe 15,000. Enough to cover whatever you've sunk into it by then." 15,000. For a condemned farmhouse on 3.4 acres of Harlan County dirt that her father bought for $9. The contempt, it was breathtaking. Nora picked up the key. She held it flat in her palm, cold, solid. It fit her hand in a way that felt strangely deliberate. "Why would he do this?" she asked. Not to Raymond, not to Sylvia. To Hawkins, the only person in that room she trusted with the question. Hawkins studied her for a long moment. "He told me that each of his children was receiving exactly what they deserved and exactly what they needed. He said you, in particular, would understand what to do with it. Even if you didn't know that yet." Raymond said, rising, buttoning his jacket. He gave her shoulder a single pat, a gesture that somehow managed to feel like a dismissal. __quote_16__. He and Sylvia walked out together, already talking. Next steps, estate logistics, the truck, the investment account. Hawkins gathered his papers. He handed Nora a second set, a property survey, a county inspection notice, and a photograph. The photograph showed a 2-story farmhouse set back from a gravel road, white paint curling off in long strips. A porch pulling away from the front of the house at a troubling angle. One upstairs window sealed with plywood. A handwritten "No Trespassing" sign stapled to a post at the edge of a yard swallowed by weeds. Nora sat alone at the mahogany table. An envelope, a key, a photograph. And 2 children who had quietly fallen asleep in their chairs without a single person noticing. She stared at that photograph for a long time. She had nowhere to go. She and the kids had been living out of her 2019 Honda Civic for 6 weeks. Ever since the apartment in Memphis she'd rented on her caregiver's salary became impossible the week her last client passed away. $214 in her bank account, 2 children, a car with a slow leak in the rear left tire, and now a condemned farmhouse in a county she'd never set foot in. Her brother thought it was a joke. Her sister thought it was an insult. But Nora Callahan looked at that photograph and saw something neither of them had bothered to look closely enough to notice. Through all that damage and rot, through paint curling off in ribbons, and a porch that leaned like a drunk man, and windows sealed behind plywood, the bones of that house still held. Fire had come for it. Tennessee winters had come for it. Years of nothing and nobody had come for it. And still the walls stood. Nora closed her fingers around the key and thought, the walls are the whole point. She woke Chloe and Ben gently. held them both in the cold morning air outside Hawkins and Briggs. Just held them. A mother's arms around two small bodies in a parking lot, and for a moment that was enough. Then she buckled them into the back seat, typed 22 Dust Mill Road into her phone, and turned the engine over. They had a farmhouse to meet. The drive to Harlan County ran just under 2 hours. Nora drove in the kind of focused silence that had become her natural state these past 6 weeks. No radio, eyes fixed ahead. Her mind cycling through numbers and possibilities the way it always did when the options were bad and she needed to manufacture a good one from nothing. Chloe sat behind her, reading a library book she'd borrowed 3 towns back and never returned. Ben had slipped back into sleep, his cheek flattened against the glass, mouth hanging open. Nora turned in slowly. Gravel popped and crunched beneath the tires. She drove maybe 100 yards before the farmhouse revealed itself in full, and she stopped the car completely. The photograph Hawkins had given her hadn't prepared her. Distance had softened things in that picture, blurred the truth. In person, there was no mercy. 2 stories of weathered white sitting on a low stone foundation, and every inch of it looked like it had been losing a slow argument with time for 30 years straight. The front porch had pulled away from the main structure on its left side. It sagged toward the ground at an angle that said one good wind would finish what gravity had started. Every ground floor window was either sealed with plywood or shattered entirely, glass long gone, frames blackened with moisture damage. The fire Sylvia had mentioned had consumed most of the right side of the second floor. The exterior wall up there was charred and bowing outward. A whole section of roof above it had buckled inward, tearing a ragged wound in the roofline that left dark rafters exposed to open sky. Weeds owned the yard. A collapsed fence traced the left side of the property. Its posts rotted through at the base, lying flat in the grass like something that had simply surrendered. Behind the house, walk the full perimeter before stepping foot inside. Study the foundation, the roofline, every exterior wall. The stone foundation was ancient but unshaken. Mortar had crumbled in spots, but the stones themselves sat massive and immovable. The left side and the front, untouched by fire, stood structurally sound. Wood had gone soft in patches, but the framing underneath still held. The porch looked terrible. Cosmetic damage, nothing more. The right side and part of the rear told a different story entirely. Fire had done its work there. Years of wind and rain and neglect had finished what the flames started, but the bones remained. Nora stood at the back edge of the property and forced herself to see the house not as it was, but as it could become. Tall windows, good proportions, a generous footprint, 3.4 acres of land, and somewhere along the back boundary, a creek she could hear running but not yet find with her eyes. A barn battered but still standing. She walked to the car and pulled the key from the envelope. The front door was chained shut with a padlock, the links rusted nearly through. The bolt cutters she'd bought on the way sat untouched. Steady pressure was all it took. The chain snapped dry and brittle. She fit the old iron key into the lock. It fought her. Metal ground against rust. Then it gave, a deep mechanical click that bounced off the porch boards and died in the silence. Nora pushed the door wide. The smell reached her first. Damp wood, ash, old earth. And beneath all of it, something she couldn't quite name. Dry and faintly sweet, like cedar or paper that had been sitting in darkness for decades. She stood in the doorway, letting her eyes pull shapes from the dimness inside. Chloe pressed against her left side, Ben against her right. The 3 of them held still at the threshold of a condemned farmhouse in Harlan County, Tennessee. $200 in the bank, no other door to walk through. Nora drew a breath. Then she crossed the threshold. Inside was darker than the exterior had warned her. She moved through the entrance hall with her phone raised, its thin light slicing the gloom. Chloe and Ben stayed tight behind her. The hallway stretched narrow, maybe 4 feet across, with a low ceiling and walls buried under peeling wallpaper. Faded florals, yellow and green, bubbled and curling away from the plaster in long dead strips. The floor was white plank wood, invisible beneath debris. Plaster dust, leaves blown through shattered windows. The scattered remains of a life someone had left behind. A wooden chair missing its 4th leg. A picture frame swollen with moisture, its glass long shattered. Nora tested each step before trusting it with her weight. The boards groaned, flexed, held. She moved into what had been the main living room, and stopped. Even buried under all that damage, the room opened wider than she'd expected. Ceilings rose higher than standard farmhouse construction, close to 10 feet, unusual for a rural Tennessee property this old. The fireplace dominated the far wall, brick from floor to ceiling, wide enough for a person to stand inside. Its mantel survived intact beneath a thick coat of grey dust. 2 windows flanked it, boarded shut from outside, but their frames revealed the kind of width and height that would drown this room in light, if someone ever pulled those boards away. She crossed into the kitchen, smaller, practical. A cast-iron wood-burning stove still stood against the back wall, heavy, dark, entirely solid. Countertops had rotted through in places. The sink had separated from the wall, but the layout made sense, and the exterior wall showed no structural failure. A back door opened onto what had been a small covered porch. Beyond it, the yard, the barn. The door hung crooked in its frame, but when Nora lifted it slightly and pushed, it swung open. The right side of the house she approached with care. Fire damage concentrated here in what had once been a sitting room or study. The ceiling above had partially given way, dragging sections of the 2nd floor down with it. Nora did not step far into this room. She stood at its edge, assessed what she could see, then stepped back. This was not where she would begin. This was a problem for later, for when she had more knowledge, more resources, and something closer to a plan. The staircase climbed the left interior wall, opposite the fire damage, and it caught her off guard. The treads were wide, hewn from thick timber that had barely shifted across however many decades this place had stood. Nora ascended slowly, one hand braced against the wall, testing every step. 3 rooms divided the 2nd floor. The 2 on the right showed smoke damage, one with a whole section of roof caved in, letting a column of grey afternoon light pour through. But the bedroom on the left side sat untouched by flame. Small, square. A single window facing out over the fields, dusty floor but level, walls intact. This would be their room, for now at least. That evening she laid out 2 sleeping areas on the floor with blankets from the car. She found a section of kitchen floor that was solid, swept it clean with a branch dragged from the yard, and they ate crackers and peanut butter by the glow of her phone. Ben fell asleep the way he always did, completely, without argument. Chloe lay on her back staring at the ceiling for a long time before she spoke. Quiet, almost a whisper. Nora lay beside her in the dark. She stared at the ceiling too. She said. The first week was survival and assessment. She drove to the nearest town, a small place called Millbrook, 12 miles down the county road, and bought the cheapest cleaning supplies she could find. Broom, mop, garbage bags, a box of basic tools, a utility knife. 2 full days she did nothing but haul debris from the ground floor, bag after bag carried out and stacked at the property's edge. She found rhythm in the labor, the way she always had with physical work. That particular rhythm that silences the thinking mind and lets the body lead. She set a camp stove on the kitchen counter for heating water and simple meals. She located the water shutoff and the electrical panel, both disconnected, both needing professional hands before either could be safely restored. 2 broken ground floor windows she patched with plastic sheeting and duct tape, enough to keep wind and animals out. She propped the front porch supports with lumber scavenged from the barn. Not a real fix, just enough to stop the lean from worsening before she could address it properly. By week's end, the ground floor was clear, and she could walk through every room without stepping over something. The house felt different when it was clean. It breathed differently. There was a quality she hadn't been able to sense through all the wreckage, something solid and purposeful in the way it was laid out, the way each room flowed into the next. It was during the second week that it started. Nora was in the living room, running her hand along the wall beside the fireplace, checking plaster for soft spots, the kind that signal water damage or structural failure behind the surface. She pressed her palm flat and felt it. Not softness, not damage, something else entirely. A seam, straight, deliberate, running vertically from about knee height to above her head. Not a crack from settling. A seam that had been plastered over and painted, intentionally concealed, but unmistakably there. She pressed harder. The wall gave slightly. Not collapsing, but flexing in a way that solid plaster over solid framing should never flex. Nora stepped back and looked at that wall with completely different eyes. She ran her flashlight along it slowly, and now that she was looking, she could see it. A rectangle, roughly 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, plastered and painted to match the surrounding wall so precisely that you would never notice it. Not unless you were searching for something wrong. Someone had placed something behind that wall, and someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure nobody would ever find it. Nora stood very still in the quiet farmhouse, her flashlight trained on that rectangle of wall, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, not desperation, something closer to the feeling you get at the very beginning of something, when you don't yet know what it is, but every instinct in your body is telling you to pay attention. She went to find a hammer. The hammer was an old one from the barn, handle worn smooth by decades of grip, head solid and heavy. Nora stood before that plastered rectangle in the living room wall. She held the hammer for a long, still moment, then swung. The first blow punched clean through. A small cloud of white dust bloomed into the air. She pulled back, swung again. The hole widened. Then she stopped, shone her flashlight into the gap. Behind the plaster was not insulation, not framing. Not the dark, empty cavity she'd braced herself for. Behind the plaster was wood, old wood, blackened by decades, fitted together with a precision that stopped her breath. Horizontal planks, smooth and tight-joined, not structural, something built with purpose, and then sealed away. Nora slowed herself down. She stopped swinging hard. Instead, she pried plaster away in careful sections, pulling chunks free with her bare hands, setting them on the floor gently, as though the sound might disturb whatever waited behind that wall. 20 minutes to clear enough to understand what she was seeing. A cabinet, built directly into the wall cavity, framed and fitted with horizontal shelves, spanning the full height and width of that plastered rectangle. The wood was dark walnut, old growth, dense and fine-grained in a way no modern lumber could match. The craftsmanship was stunning. Every shelf sat perfectly level. No background in historical artifacts. But she knew enough to know this was not junk. Every piece had been wrapped with deliberate care, hidden with intention. Someone had constructed a concealed cabinet inside the wall of this farmhouse and filled it with things they believed worth protecting. The questions pressed in. When and why? And what exactly was she holding? If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel. It means a great deal. Now, back to it. Chloe appeared in the doorway while Nora still knelt on the floor, surrounded by unwrapped objects. The girl's eyes went wide. She crouched beside her mother and picked up the ceramic pitcher carefully, both hands. The way she held things she already understood were fragile. Noah said, Ben came in behind his sister, saw the hole in the plaster, immediately wanted to make it bigger. Nora redirected him to flashlight duty instead, which he accepted with deep seriousness. They spent the rest of that afternoon documenting everything. Nora photographed each object before and after unwrapping, using her phone with a flashlight propped against the wall for clear images. The cabinet held 23 objects in total, glass bottles of various sizes, all hand-blown. 4 pieces of ceramic pottery, each painted by hand. The coin collection, more than 60 individual coins, dates spanning from the 1820s through the 1880s. A small oil lamp, its glass chimney still intact. 2 hand-carved wooden figures, folk art, one a horse, one a human form, both rendered with exceptional detail. And at the very back of the lowest shelf, wrapped in 2 layers of cloth and then in a piece of old leather cinched with cord, a journal. Small. Bound in brown leather gone dark and rigid with age. Nora untied the cord with careful fingers, opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the penmanship of someone who had learned it formally in an earlier era. The ink had weathered to a soft brown, but every word remained sharp and clear. At the top of the first page, a name written in deliberate, careful letters. Elias Greer. Beneath it, a date, April 1888. Nora lowered herself to the dusty farmhouse floor, her 2 children pressed close on either side, and began to read by the glow of her phone screen. The voice rising from those pages was measured, exact. The voice of a man who never wasted a word and stood behind each one he chose. Elias Greer had been a craftsman, a furniture maker, a woodworker who had raised this farmhouse with his own hands in 1871 and never left it for the rest of his days. He had never married. He had no children. And in the spring of 1888, feeling his body beginning to fail, he had made a choice about the objects he'd spent a lifetime creating and collecting. He chose to conceal them. Not from fear, not exactly. From what he described in his own careful words as a desire to keep them from those who would sell them without understanding what they were. He believed the right person would come eventually. He wrote that he trusted the house itself to hold everything safe until that person arrived. He catalogued every object placed inside the cabinet, described each piece, recorded where several had come from, what they had cost him, in time, in material, in care. Nora turned pages slowly, using only the tips of her fingers. When she reached the final entry, she sat still for a long while. Then her gaze moved across the objects arranged on the floor around her, and something caught in her chest. These were not just old things. Elias Greer had been a craftsman of genuine, serious skill, working in an era when American folk art and handmade objects reached a level of quality the modern world had largely abandoned. The coins alone, based on their dates and the fragments of information she could pull up on her phone through the weak signal out here, might carry real value. The pottery, the glass, the carved figures, the lamp. She needed an expert, someone who truly understood what they were looking at. But sitting there on the floor of a farmhouse her father had purchased for $9, reading the journal of a man dead for over a century, a man who had trusted his house to guard his life's work, Nora Callahan felt something shift deep inside her chest. Her father had known. He must have known. Walter Grimes had bought this property at a tax auction and done nothing with it. Never renovated, never sold, never even mentioned it to her directly. But he had left it to her, specifically, deliberately. Not to Raymond, who would have flipped it the same week. Not to Sylvia, who would have hired someone to clear the place without glancing twice at a single thing inside. To her, the one who showed up, the one who paid attention, the one who could recognize what something was worth when no one else bothered to look. She closed the journal gently and held it in both hands. Beyond the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields burned gold in the late afternoon light. Ben had fallen asleep against her arm. Chloe sat examining the hand-carved horse with quiet focus, turning it slowly, tracing its lines with one finger. Nora watched her daughter and thought about Elias Greer sealing that cabinet in 1888, writing in his journal that the right person would come. She thought about her father paying $9 for a condemned farmhouse and leaving it to the only one of his children who would have walked through the door instead of turning away. Sometimes the most important things in a person's life arrive disguised as nothing at all. The morning after discovering Elias Greer's hidden cabinet, Nora drove into Millbrook carrying the journal, 3 ceramic pieces wrapped carefully in clean cloth, and the coin collection sealed in a Ziploc bag she'd pulled from her car's glove compartment. She had searched online the night before, fighting the farmhouse's weak signal, and found an antiques shop in town, Harland Collectibles. A small storefront on the main street, operating for over 30 years if its faded window lettering could be trusted. The owner, a compact, precise woman in her late 60s named Beverly Marsh, looked at what Nora placed on her counter and went very still. The particular kind of still that only comes from genuine expertise meeting something that demands its full attention. Beverly studied each ceramic piece beneath her magnifying glass in silence. She turned the coins slowly, one after another, placing certain ones into a separate pile with deliberate care. She read 3 full pages of Elias Greer's journal with a concentrated expression of someone encountering something that genuinely mattered. Then she removed her magnifying glass and looked at Nora directly. "Where did you get these?" Nora told her. "The farmhouse on Dust Mill Road." Beverly held her gaze for a long moment. "Walter Grimes' property?" "Yes," Nora said. "He was my father. He left it to me." Beverly lowered herself onto the stool behind her counter. She said nothing for so long that Nora started to feel uneasy. Then Beverly spoke. Quote _31_ mid-1800s regional folk art, from a tradition that produced very few surviving examples in this condition. The coins included several that were genuinely rare. A couple she would want a specialist to confirm, but her preliminary assessment was that the collection as a whole carried real weight. This journal, she tapped the cover gently, if authentic, and she believed it was, it constituted a primary historical document. Elias Greer was a recognized figure in Harlan County craft history. 2 of his pieces sat in the State Museum in Nashville. Nora heard every word and absorbed them steadily, the way she always absorbed significant information, without visible reaction, until she'd had time to understand what she was actually being told. "What are we talking about in terms of value?" Beverly folded her hands on the counter. She wanted a full appraisal conducted by a qualified specialist before offering any numbers. But speaking as someone who had spent 31 years in this business, she did not think Nora should sell anything until she understood exactly what she possessed. What she could say was that Nora should treat those objects as serious assets and handle them accordingly. Nora drove back to the farmhouse carrying Beverly's card and the name of an appraiser in Nashville, someone who specialized in American folk art and historical artifacts. She had called from the parking lot outside the shop and booked an appointment for the following week. She had also, for the first time since leaving Memphis 6 weeks ago, allowed something cautiously close to hope to settle inside her chest. But hope without labor was just wishing. And Nora had never been someone who wished. She was someone who worked. So she worked. Every day from first light until the darkness pushed her inside. She worked on the farmhouse because whatever those artifacts might eventually be worth, they were not worth anything yet. The property was condemned, uninhabitable, and it would stay that way until her own hands changed it. The same impossible equation faced her now that had faced her the morning of the will reading. No money, no contractors, no resources except her own body and her own stubbornness. And the same bone-deep refusal to quit that had carried her through 6 weeks of sleeping in a car with 2 children. She began with what was most dangerous. The front porch had to be stabilized before it collapsed on someone. She found 4 solid timber posts in the ruins of the barn, dragged them to the front of the house one at a time, and used them to brace the sagging porch supports. She learned the method from a basic carpentry video she watched 3 times on her phone before touching a single beam. The work consumed 2 full days. It left her shoulders burning in a way that felt like it might never fade. But when she finished, she made supply runs in the rusted pickup she'd discovered behind the barn. Its engine had seized solid, but she coaxed it back with fresh oil and a battery purchased on credit from the auto parts store in town. People saw that truck outside the hardware store. They saw lights burning at the farmhouse on Dust Mill Road, a place that had sat dark for decades. They asked their questions the way small-town folks always do, not pushy, but not subtle either. Curiosity wrapped in politeness, dressed up as passing conversation. Carl Briggs, no connection to any law firm, was a semi-retired carpenter. 40 years of work on half the houses in Millbrook lived in his hands. He drove past the farmhouse one afternoon and spotted Nora up on the roof. She was patching damaged shingles with material she'd pulled from the barn. He parked in the drive, stood at the bottom of the ladder, looked up at her for a long moment. "You know what you're doing up there?" "She didn't stop working," she said. He watched her another minute. Then he walked to his truck, grabbed his own tool belt, came back and climbed the ladder. Carl returned 4 more times over the next 2 weeks. Never called ahead. Always brought something useful. A box of roofing nails, a tube of weatherproof sealant. Once, a full sheet of plywood. Leftovers from another job, he claimed. He never accepted payment, deflected every attempt Nora made to give something back. He mentioned once that he had a daughter about her age. Then he let it go. A retired school teacher named B. Holloway lived 3 miles down the road. She showed up one evening carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil and 2 juice boxes for the children. Said she'd heard about the woman fixing up the old Greer farmhouse. That was what locals had always called it, and she wanted to see for herself. Looked at Nora with the composed expression of a professional delivering significant news. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I want to be precise because precision matters here. The ceramic collection, exceptional. Pieces in this condition from this regional tradition were essentially museum quality. The coin collection included 3 coins he classified as genuinely rare and 1 he needed to send photographs of to a colleague for confirmation. His working estimate, he stressed, was conservative. The carved figures, fine examples of Tennessee folk sculpture. The glass was period correct, hand-blown quality excellent. The journal was a primary document of real historical significance. He opened his notebook to a page of figures, turned it toward her. "This is my preliminary range. Final appraisal will take several weeks and involve 2 additional specialists. But I want you to have a working number so you understand what you're dealing with." Nora looked at the page. The range covered the collection as a whole. The low end, $340,000. The high end, $480,000. She read those numbers twice, looked up at Dr. Whitfield. He nodded once, confirming what her eyes already told her. Outside the farmhouse windows, the Tennessee fields stretched green and wide, entirely indifferent to the fact that everything had just shifted beneath her feet. She called Theodore Hawkins the following morning. Told him about Raymond's call, the nature of the argument being floated. Asked him directly, what exposure did she have? Hawkins was characteristically steady. The artifacts were discovered within the property after title had transferred to her. They were never inventoried as part of the estate because nobody knew they existed. Under Tennessee property law, contents discovered within an inherited property after transfer of title belonged to the title holder. Their claim carried no merit. However, he added, that doesn't mean they won't file something anyway. People file lawsuits for reasons that have nothing to do with justice. They file to squeeze, to bleed someone dry through legal fees, to crush whoever they believe has less money to fight back. Nora absorbed this truth quietly. She asked the obvious question. What would it cost to defend? Hawkins didn't sugarcoat it. If they push through to discovery, you're looking at serious money. Potentially $50,000 or more, depending on how aggressive they get. Against a collection valued at close to $500,000. A real number. Not devastating, given what she stood to protect. But real. Nora thanked him and ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse Elias Greer had built in 1871, and she thought about what was really happening here. Her siblings had laughed at her inheritance. Laughed. They had offered her $15,000 for land and a structure now understood to hold nearly $500,000 in historical artifacts. They had walked out of the will reading without a backward glance, certain they had claimed everything worth claiming, certain they had left her with dust and rot and nothing. And now that the nothing had turned out to be something extraordinary, they wanted their cut. Not because they had earned it, not because they had spent a single hour working for it, not because they had slept one night on a cold floor believing, but because it existed, and they didn't have it. Sylvia called 2 days after Raymond. Different strategy, softer edges. She talked about their childhood, about their father, about the way money could shatter a family and how she didn't want that for them. She used the word unfair 3 times in the first 5 minutes. Every single time, she meant unfair to herself, not to Nora. She proposed a voluntary split of the artifact proceeds, a third each, suggesting this would reflect the kind of character their father had always wanted his children to carry. Nora let her finish, every word. Then she spoke. The softness drained from Sylvia's voice like water from cracked stone. "You're being selfish," she said. Nora didn't argue, quote she said. She hung up, went back to work. The formal legal threat landed 9 days later. A letter from a Nashville firm representing Raymond and Sylvia jointly. It claimed the artifacts were undisclosed estate assets. It demanded immediate cessation of any sale or transfer pending resolution. Nora read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, photographed it, sent the image to Hawkins. His reply came within the hour. __quote _43 __. Don't worry. She wasn't worried, not exactly. She was tired in that specific way people get tired when they've done everything right and still have to defend it. But she had faced harder things than a bad faith letter from a Nashville law firm. She had faced a condemned building with 2 children and $200 in her pocket. She had faced 6 weeks sleeping in a car through winter. She had faced a wall that needed a hammer and found the courage to swing it. Whatever Raymond and Sylvia threw at her next, she would meet it the same way she met everything, directly, without flinching. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning, late October. Harlan County Courthouse, a solid brick building on the main square of Millbrook. It smelled like floor wax and old wood. That particular institutional silence of places where serious things get decided. Nora arrived early with Theodore Hawkins. He had driven down from Clarksville the evening before, stayed at the small motel on the highway rather than make the trip twice. He carried a leather briefcase. Nora had come to understand that briefcase held everything her father had ever said, written, or communicated about the will. Organized, documented, with the thoroughness of a man who had seen this fight coming long before it arrived. Raymond and Sylvia showed up together. 2 attorneys from the Nashville firm flanked them, both younger than Nora expected, both carrying the polished confidence of people who'd been assured their case was airtight. Raymond wore a dark suit, stared straight ahead. Sylvia wore grey. She glanced at Nora once in the hallway, an expression that wanted to say regret, but mostly said fear. Their attorneys had filed a motion claiming the artifacts found at 22 Dust Mill Road were undisclosed estate assets, inequitably distributed through omission. The argument hinged on one assertion, that Walter Grimes had known about the hidden cabinet and its contents when he drafted the will, that he had deliberately concealed this from the other beneficiaries. It was a constructed argument. Nora had recognized that from the very start. But constructed arguments filed with courts still demanded answers, still devoured time and money and energy, and that was exactly why they had been filed. The judge assigned to the case was Honorable Ruth Daring, 60 years old, known throughout Harlan County for moving through her docket with efficiency and tolerating almost nothing she deemed a waste of the court's time. Hawkins presented first, methodical, unhurried. The way Nora had come to expect him to approach all things. He submitted documentation of every meeting he had conducted with Walter Grimes during the drafting of the will, his own detailed notes from each session, and a signed affidavit he had prepared, one Walter had signed 6 months before his death, specifically addressing the Dust Mill Road property. He presented this document to Judge Daring with a single explanation. Walter Grimes had anticipated a legal challenge. He had taken deliberate steps to foreclose it. Judge Daring made a sound that in a less formal setting would have passed for a short laugh. Then opposing counsel advanced their secondary argument, the one Nora had been dreading most. They suggested that Nora's prolonged presence as caregiver during the final years of Walter Grimes' life represented an opportunity for undue influence, that the disproportionate nature of the bequest warranted scrutiny of the circumstances under which the will had been executed. This was the argument that turned a legal filing into something personal. The suggestion that Nora had manipulated her father, that her care had been strategic rather than genuine, that the woman who had driven 4 hours every few months, organized medications, sat through hospitalizations, had done all of it to position herself for an inheritance. Nora sat at the table beside Hawkins. She kept her face still. She had prepared herself for this. She had known it was coming from the moment Raymond made his first phone call on the barn roof. It still landed hard. Not because it shook her certainty about what she had done or why. Because it reduced something real and human and difficult to a legal tactic. That reduction was its own kind of cruelty. Hawkins responded without raising his voice. He submitted affidavits from Walter Grimes' physician, from his neighbor of 12 years, from the staff of the rehabilitation facility where Walter had spent 6 weeks following his second stroke. Each document attested to Walter's mental clarity, his strong will, his explicit, repeatedly stated pride in Nora's dedication, the complete absence of any indication that his decisions were shaped by anything other than his own clear judgment. He submitted records showing that Raymond and Sylvia had not visited their father in the final 2 years of his life. Not once. He did not editorialize. He simply submitted the documents and let them speak. Judge Daring reviewed everything before her with the precision of someone who'd spent decades reading rooms before rooms were ready to be read. The courtroom had gone still. That particular stillness that settles when everyone already knows the answer, but no one can say it yet. Raymond sat with his jaw locked. Sylvia had stopped writing 20 minutes ago, eyes fixed on the table. Judge Daring set down the final document and spoke. The claim of undisclosed estate assets found no support in the will's language or the documented intent of the testator. The claim of undue influence found no support in any evidence presented, and was in fact directly contradicted by the defense's substantial documentation. The motion was denied, in its entirety. She said it the way someone closes a door they have no intention of touching again. She looked at opposing counsel and told them she hoped their clients understood that the court's time was a shared resource. Then she moved on to the next case. Nora sat still for a moment after the gavel fell. Hawkins collected his papers with the quiet efficiency of a man who had never doubted this outcome. Outside, October air hit sharp and bright. The maples lining the main square had turned fully red. Raymond and Sylvia emerged a minute behind Nora and Hawkins. Their attorneys were already on their phones. Raymond looked at Nora across the courthouse steps with something she'd never seen on his face before. Not calculation, not contempt, not that careful friendliness of a man working an angle. Just a man standing in the cold, looking at his sister, with nothing left to say that could matter. Sylvia spoke first. Her voice was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it." Nora looked at her for a long moment. She believed the apology was real, or as real as Sylvia could make it under the circumstances. "That matters," Nora said. "It just doesn't change anything." She turned and walked with Hawkins toward his car. Behind her, Raymond said something low to Sylvia. Sylvia responded. Then silence. Nora did not look back. Hawkins drove her to the farmhouse. They sat in the driveway for a moment before she stepped out. "Your father would be proud," he said. The same words he'd spoken at the end of the will reading. They meant more the second time. Nora nodded. She climbed out and stood in the yard of 22 Dust Mill Road, looking at the farmhouse in the October light. The windows were clear. The porch was straight and solid. Smoke from the kitchen stove's chimney rose in a clean, thin line against cold blue sky. Inside, Ben laughing at something. Chloe's voice answering him. The building was still condemned on paper. There was still so much work ahead. But it was hers, completely, officially, finally hers. And nobody was going to take it. She went inside to her children. The artifact sale unfolded in stages over the following 3 months, handled through Dr. Whitfield's network, specialist dealers, auction houses, private collectors who moved through the quiet, deliberate world of serious American historical objects. Nora had decided early she would not rush it, would not accept the first offer on anything. She had waited this long. The right buyers were worth finding. Dr. Whitfield managed the negotiations with the same careful precision he brought to everything. And Nora sat across from collectors, dealers, museum representatives with that steady attention she'd carried through every hard chapter of her life. Listening more than speaking. Asking questions that made clear she understood what she held. Declining offers that undervalued it, without apology, without hesitation. The ceramic collection sold first. A private collector in Charleston who had spent 11 years searching for a complete set of regional Tennessee folk pottery. The price landed at the high end of Dr. Whitfield's range for those pieces. The coin collection was divided between 2 buyers, a numismatic specialist in Chicago and a private collector in Virginia who wanted the 3 rarest pieces specifically. The carved wooden figures found their home at a folk art gallery in Asheville, one that had been chasing examples of Tennessee sculpture from that era for a permanent exhibition. After his fee and the various auction house commissions, Nora received $371,000. She sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse where Elias Greer had once sat. She looked at the number on her phone screen for a long time. It was the largest number ever attached to her name in any context that wasn't a debt. She did not cry. She sat perfectly still. Let it become real at whatever pace it needed. The first thing she did with the money was not what anyone expected. She didn't pay off debt, though she carried some. She didn't buy a new car, though hers was dying. The first thing Nora Callahan did was call the Harland County Building Department. She requested a meeting with the county inspector to begin the formal process of reviewing and lifting the condemnation order on 22 Dust Mill Road. She had been working on that farmhouse for months. She knew what it needed structurally, and now she had the resources to do it properly. She wanted it done right. She wanted it done officially. She wanted the building that Elias Greer had constructed in 1871 with his own hands to be recognized by the same county that condemned it as the sound and valuable structure it actually was. She hired Carl Briggs to oversee the renovation. He accepted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd been hoping she would ask. She hired locally for everything she could, paid fair wages, took time to explain to each worker what she was preserving and why. The cast iron wood-burning stove in the kitchen was restored by a specialist, Carl New, in Knoxville. The white plank floors were cleaned and refinished by hand. Every single board kept original. The fireplace was repointed. The chimney rebuilt from the roofline up. The fire-damaged right side of the house, the largest undertaking, required new framing and new exterior walls. But Carl was meticulous. He matched materials and methods to the original construction wherever possible. The barn was rebuilt over 6 weeks in early spring. Timber milled from trees that had come down on the property during a winter storm. Trees Nora had set aside specifically for this purpose. Her face carried the expression of someone watching a thing restored to what it had always deserved to be. "This is what it looked like," she said quietly. "In the old photographs, this is exactly what it looked like." Nora stood beside her, studying the image. She had never laid eyes on those photographs, and yet somehow her hands had brought the place back to what it once was. The open house she held that evening wasn't meant as a celebration. It was quieter than that, an acknowledgement that something had been finished, and that the people who'd poured themselves into it deserved to witness what their effort had become. Carl came with his wife. Beverly Marsh from Harland Collectibles arrived and lingered in the living room, her gaze fixed on the wall beside the fireplace. Repaired now, repainted, the hidden cabinet gone, but its outline still ghosting through the surface if you knew where to look. Doctor. Whitfield drove down from Nashville and moved through every room with the slow satisfaction of a man whose knowledge had served something real. Theodore Hawkins came and stood in the kitchen, said nothing for a long while, then said, "Your father was right about you," which was the only sentence Nora needed to hear that night, or any night. Chloe and Ben tore through the house and the yard and the barn with the wild ease of children who sensed, without anyone explaining, that something had shifted beneath them, that their lives had changed in a way that would hold. Ben had claimed the left side bedroom months ago. He'd covered the wall with drawings of the farmhouse at different stages of renovation, taped up in rough chronological order. Nora found that wall more moving than she could put into words. Chloe had asked to keep a photograph of Elias Greer, a formal portrait from the 1880s provided by the Tennessee State Museum during their research. A lean, careful-looking man with a woodworker's hands. It hung now in a small frame on the living room wall, near where the hidden cabinet had been. Because Chloe said he should be able to see what happened to his house, and Nora had agreed completely. That evening, after everyone had gone, she stood on the rooftop deck she'd built from reclaimed lumber at the back of the house. Warm April dark. The fields invisible around her, the creek murmuring at the edge of the property, the farmhouse solid beneath her feet. She thought about the morning of the will reading, Raymond laughing, Sylvia shaking her head. Nora Callahan looked out across the dark Tennessee fields and drew the cold spring air deep into her lungs and felt, for the first time and longer than she could remember, completely and entirely at peace. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting right on your screen. If this one landed, those will too. Just click and see for yourself. And make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload.